Well, hello and welcome everybody to today's event, the EU Single Market, the key to unlock the Green Deal. A warm welcome to our panelists, to everybody joining online. Thanks to everyone for making some time on this Thursday afternoon. So today we have quite a very interesting topic. If we think about all of the things that are happening in the EU right now, the focus on decarbonization, on the Green Deal, on the circular economy. And if we look to the core of what the European project is about, it's the single market and bringing all these diverse member states together to make sure that services can flow, that goods can flow, that we can do business everywhere across this great union. We have a really great panel today to talk about that. I'm going to introduce them in a second. First, a few words of housekeeping. Obviously, we would love to hear from you throughout the session. If you're joining through Glisser, which you probably are, you'll see a little blue a plus icon in the bottom right of your screen. That's what you can use to just chat or to ask questions. So please do that throughout the show. A reminder that today's event will be recorded. So please keep that in mind as you participate, and you will be able to access a recording of this later. I think that's it for housekeeping. We're going to kick off with a few introductory remarks from Francesca Stevens, who is the Managing Director of EUROPEN, which is the European Organization for Packaging and the Environment. She'll then introduce our gracious host for today, Ms. Maria Spiraki, MEP from Greece, and then we'll meet the rest of the panel. So over to you, Francesca.
Thank you very much, Brett, and good afternoon to all the participants. Thank you very much for joining this webinar today. So indeed, the topic of today is the single market and how it is important for the Green Deal. Let me just start with why we chose this topic. We feel that the single market is crucial to the green transition. And if I can just say 2 words about EUROPEN and our mission, we represent the packaging supply chain. And from our creation over 30 years ago, we are nearly as old as the single market. The mission has really been to advance packaging sustainability while preserving the integrity of the single market. So for us, really, this is a core topic that we see go hand in hand with sustainability. And so we would like to discuss some of the market fragmentation that we are observing increasingly across the EU. Why these are bad? Clearly for competitiveness, because of course business operating in Europe are based on a model which is relying on a functioning single market, which drives long-term investment. But it's also a fragmented single market bad for sustainability. Because it drives reserves away from investment into circular economy and green solution. It can also result into additional waste of resources and products, and sure we'll discuss that in more detail in just a moment. So really an important topic, we believe. Happy to have many participants attending today to discuss it, and also distinguished speakers to further elaborate on this topic today. But first of all, I'd like to indeed introduce our host today, Maria Spiraki. Maria Spiraki is a member of the European Parliament from Greece, and she's already served in the 2nd term. So she's a long-standing member of the Environment Committee and the Industry Committee. So indeed, 2 very important committees for the discussion we're about to have today. She's also co-chair of the Intergroup on Climate Change, Biodiversity and Sustainable Development. And so in her work, Ms. Spiraki clearly dealt with many issues in relation to advancing sustainability. She's been very engaged as well to address the implication that this has for industry, what industry needs to deliver as well, and what is the infrastructure needed from a regulatory point of view to make sure that this can actually be happening. So very pleased and very happy and thankful to you, Ms. Spiraki, for hosting this debate today. And with that, I will give back the floor to you, Brett.
And I would join you and ask everyone to join us in welcoming Ms. Spiraki, and would be absolutely fantastic if you would share some opening thoughts for us. Over to you.
trying to unmute myself. Thank you very much for having me and giving me the opportunity to elaborate further to the issue of the single market, because I'm one of the persons here in the Parliament which strongly believe that we have to overcome the barriers and we have to proceed as a single market in order to transform our economy into green and digital. And by saying this, I would like just to remind that the single market was the driver for our European Union and is probably the most extraordinary yet tangible outcome of the ongoing European integration project. However, we must ensure that the integrity of the single market is not jeopardizing, neither by poor internal policies, nor by external economic pressures, especially if we want to realistically achieve the goals of Green Deal. And by saying this, I would like just to remind that in order to achieve the green transition, one of the pillars of the Green Deal, the EU needs large investors. We have to invest heavily in new technologies to deliver results. The issue for me, according to my opinion, is that we have to invest in infrastructures as well. It has been already mentioned, especially when it comes to the way that we are serving the issue of circular economy and we are serving the transformation of our energy mix as a whole. I have three priorities to set on the table before we elaborate further on this topic today, and also on the topic of packaging. The first is the elephant in the room that we have to address, and it is the energy cost. It is a problem of our single market. As we all know, the energy mix is a national competence, and the EU has the role only to make some kind of suggestion, and this is the role that the EU take yesterday when the Commission started proposing the toolkit. Maybe during next week, during the meeting of the leaders of the leaders and the head of governments, we will have an outcome concerning the voluntary joint procurements when it comes to the energy procurements and also to the strategic reserves that we need. But it is important to overcome the barriers between member states, and it is also important to have a coordinated action. It is important to act on the energy crisis, and not only on the energy crisis, on the issue of the energy mix and how can we enhance the proportion of the green energy as a single market and not as a fragmented market. The second issue I would like to set on the table is how shall we set standards? It is important to set standards to our products. It's not only important to set standards for the internal market, the single market, which is the strongest single market in the world, but also to be very ambitious to set global standards in order to create a global level playing field. I was one of the authors on the motion for a resolution of the European Chemical Strategy for Sustainability, and I think that it is a very, very good opportunity to proceed with sustainable, innovative, and above all, safe chemical products. And in this regard, it is important to start setting standards to different sectors. And the third issue I would like to touch upon is how can we introduce streamlined ambitious policies in key sectors. One of the key sectors is packaging. We have to lead the world in this regard. We have to lead the world by setting the standards and creating at the same time business cases. By saying this, I would like just to remind that one of the issues that we are facing, and we face it in my home country, Greece, is the way that we can collect and select enough sufficient and high quality quantity of packaging waste in order to give the opportunity to have a profitable business when it comes to reuse and finally to recollect and finally to recycle the materials coming from packaging. So by saying this once again, I would like to thank you for having me in this very, very interesting debate, and I am at your disposal for further questions.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Ms. Spiraki, and thanks for those words to kind of guide us as we go on. I'd like to introduce the rest of our very distinguished panel today. So in addition to Ms. Spiraki and Ms. Stevens, we have Maya de Grey-Dulou of DG Environment in the European Commission. Welcome, Maya. Nice to see you. Jérôme Perrault, who's the Secretary General of FESI, which is the Federation of the European Sporting Goods Industry. So thanks for joining us as well, Jérôme. I'd like to get straight into some questions if we may. And we've heard from the Parliament, at least one parliamentarian today. So who better than to speak to than another institutional representative? So over to the European Commission. Maya, thanks again for joining us. And just wanted to, ask if you might pick up, from a commission standpoint on this topic. Obviously, you're working with the packaging waste directive. So how does the single market story fit into that? So how are you viewing trade barriers as either a help, I don't think, or a hindrance to the work that you're trying to do?
Yes, thank you very much, Brett, for this question. First of all, packaging is a bit of a special case. I mean, it's true that it's DG Environment which is in charge of this piece of legislation. It's a directive currently, but it is based on the internal market legal basis, which means that we work quite closely also with other services, in particular DG Grow. So it's really, in a way, it is an internal market legislation as well, which means that while member states have a certain reduced margin of discretion when they are taking their when they adopt measures which go beyond the European harmonizing legislation. However, of course, all issues are currently not yet regulated in the packaging directive. In those issues, with regard to those issues, member states do have a bit more freedom, and they do adopt national measures. And this is going to probably come up in the discussion. So indeed, labeling is one of those, at least partly the labeling for sorting, for example, because how we sort our waste and how we collect our waste is currently fully national competence. There are some EU requirements, of course, stemming basically from the European Waste Framework Directive, but this is not a fully harmonized material at all. So these are some of the background issues why we are seeing this different labeling in the different member states. Now, do we see trade barriers as a positive things? No, we don't. We don't, of course, we don't. But it is, drafting of legislation and coming up with new rules, it's always a bit of an iterative process. So, for example, the packaging directive was revised in 2018. At that point of time, member states were required to introduce measures to increase reuse, for example. So that's their obligation. They need to implement this obligation. And they are currently doing this. They are in the process of transposing and implementing this amendment of 2018. That's why we also see some member states adopting measures on reuse of packaging, which industry might consider as being trade barriers. But at the same time, the directive does empower member states to take these measures. So it's a very fine line. We are aware that this is not an ideal situation. That's why we are also again now reviewing the packaging and packaging waste directive, and we want, as one of our core objectives is we want to go for more harmonization.
Thanks very much. And I think we will want to dig in on the complexity of transposition of the room for maneuver that a member state has. And I think it's in exactly that complexity that we often find ourselves with quite the challenge. So I think that will recur, a recurring subject, I think, over the course of the next 45 minutes. So thanks for that. Very nice to have you, Maya, and get to know your perspective, and we'll come back to you. Jerome, want to turn to you for a second. When I think of sporting goods, I can see them definitely traveling across borders or needing to. I'm very aware that my football or my tennis racket probably didn't come from next door here in Brussels. But can you just give us a sense, your industry, sporting goods, what does the single market actually mean for you? Why is it something that's actually key to your industry?
Well, I mean, it is key to our industry, like it is to all industries in Europe. And as we heard, I think that the single market is mainly about the free movement of goods, and this is crucial for the economic growth of the EU, of course, and for all the sectors involved. Our sector, so we're in sports equipment and goods, but also footwear and apparel, clothing, and so on. And so obviously, when we produce in, for example, Southeast Asia, but also even in Europe, it is very, very important for us that we are doing this in a I would say, harmonized and predictable business environment. And the EU with the single market is really one of the leading examples worldwide on why the EU markets is so important also for our industry. And you know, when our products are being manufactured, they are going into production lines that are not specifically aimed for one specific member state. They are imported within the EU, they end up in warehouses, and then they're being dispatched. And, you know, not going into also now what's happening with the digitization, artificial intelligence, they are sent where they are needed. So for us, this free movement of goods element is very important. And as we have seen also with the COVID-19 crisis, you know, we need supply chains that can adapt, that are fast, that are agile, and that are flexible. So once the products are within the EU, for us, it's very important that we can dispatch them within various markets, depending on the demand or unsold stocks. And I think that if we want to be in line with our sustainability engagements, we need to be able to bring these products where they are actually needed without, you know, destroying any or getting rid of any, or, you know, diverting them into a separate collection system. So I would say in two lines, this is why this is so important. And this is why also we want to avoid going back to a sort of 27 mini markets with different criteria, different labeling schemes, different sorting instructions that ultimately will create confusion for the businesses, for the consumers, and for the market surveillance authorities in the end.
Thanks, Jerome. I'm guessing that the panel that we've assembled today would agree with the statement that we don't want 27 mini markets. Otherwise, we have to go back and rewrite history as of 1950 something, right? So, Ms. Biraki, just to pick up on, you know, that fragmentation, when you look at different internal market barriers to, you know, when we're trying to build this single market, how do you feel that actually affects the EU's overall competitiveness? Is this helping us as a union, or is it again helping or hindering? I think I know the answer, but how exactly is this bad news if we have that kind of fragmentation?
Well, let me explain that it is important to start working in a bottom-up approach. And by saying this, I think that we have to increase the demand for products that they are fulfilling the same criteria and, of course, fulfilling the same standards. And in this regard, I think one of the key issues is how can we increase, how can we raise awareness when it comes to the consumers, starting from the youngest, starting from the school level. I fully support the campaigns that they are focusing on raising awareness, especially when it comes to packaging, to plastics. And I think that we can manage it by sending clear messages and by educating people in order to start asking for the products that they are sustainable and they are fulfilling the standards that the EU was setting. When it comes to the internal market and to the markets that the member states are creating, I would like to give an example which is the bad example, and it is the implementation of the plastic directive. When we start working on this directive, and I was one of the members of the parliament involved as the rapporteur on behalf of the EPP in the ITRE committee, well, we were very, very ambitious in this framework, because we start setting very, very ambitious goals in the directive. We work together with the Commission. Let me just remind to the audience that the new plastic recycling targets for 2025 is 50%, and for 2030 is 55%, and were adopted in the 2018 update of the Packaging and Packaging Waste Directive. It is also the single-use plastic one of the issues that it has also very high ambitions, but when the implementation came, the outcome is very low. According to the Court of Auditors, only one of the 4 billion allocated in the previous MFF has been invested in infrastructure used for collecting single-use plastic. So it is important to work together with the national governments, with the regional authorities, with the authorities in municipalities, in order to create the proper structures and in order to create also the proper infrastructure. At the same time, I think one of the key issues we have to manage in the small markets within the big markets is how can we create this deposit return schemes, compulsory, mandatory deposit return schemes, and of course extended producer responsibility schemes, which is the level of the producer.
Thanks for that. Some clear examples of what not to do, I think, and also some clear examples of what we need to fix. So I think that's exactly the kind of conversation everyone's looking to have, is to get down to some solutions to this. How do we actually solve this conundrum? Francesca, I wanted to turn to you for a second. I think a lot of people, when they think of the EU, they think, okay, the single market is actually finished; it's done. That's a basic pillar of the EU, so it must be done, right? And then they may think, okay, we've sorted out services. We've seen lots of examples of that, where that's worked out. Goods seems to be in another category. So do you feel that people have taken for granted that the single market for goods has been completed and it's good to go, good to ship?
Yeah, thanks, Brad, for the question. I think to a certain extent, yes. To a certain extent, we kind of felt, and we saw, right, we saw the benefit of a strong single market, and the focus was mainly to remove, some of the remaining barriers, and indeed concentrate, digital in particular, making sure we create a single market for digital products, completing single market for services and capitals. But the situation for the goods, I don't think it's as positive as it might be assumed, particularly because we are seeing new barriers coming up. So we are actually reversing the trend, and the problem is not just making sure we eliminate the remaining ones, but it's really now focusing on how do we prevent new barriers from coming up. And I hear Maya, and I totally understand, and I think we know why. It's commendable the member states are in fact also supporting the effort to moving towards circularity and adopting measures also in implementation of previous legislative acts. But at the same time, and perhaps that's another issue that needs to be addressed. How do we prevent these distortions? So from what you say, like, can we really blame the member states? I think on the cases of labeling, perhaps there is no harmonized regime in the EU, and therefore we know what both the legislation, the treaty, and the jurisprudence say about that. But to the extent where there is some kind of framework at the European level, how far member states can go. Again, I think the treaty are quite clear when it comes to going beyond. There are certain principles enshrined in the treaty that says how far beyond can you go, how do you justify this, and how does this not represent an additional barrier to trade. So I think that point needs to be addressed. And while indeed the directive is being now reviewed, and we clearly very much support a stronger harmonization of fundamental provision, we are already dealing with these impacts today. So we are dealing with these distortions today, and waiting 2-3 years time frame for the new framework to be in place, and then eventually its implementation is just not feasible. So I think there is a question of timing. There is also a question, and Ms. Piraki points as well, about the standards. Clearly, what the Packaging Waste Directive, for example, does, but I think many other directives to that extent dealing with specific products do, is indeed setting the requirements, essential requirements in the directive. We know that's a part that needs to be strengthened in the case of the Packaging Waste Directive, and that's part of the review process. But standards are key, but so are core provisions. So we also see, and you mentioned, Ms. Piraki, the Single-Use Plastic Directive. Indeed, we think that a lot was left, and perhaps because it was a bit rushed. We can certainly say that it was adopted at a very, very speedy time. But a lot has been left to implementing measures, to guidelines that came very late after the entry into force, or after when economic operator had to comply with those requirements, and that's just not feasible. So we had members clearly asking, what do we need to print? Because we need to send the product ready for distribution by the date, but we don't know because the implementing regulation is just not there yet. So I think making sure to the extent possible that the core principles are already in the main body of legislation perhaps is a way to support this effort and prevent that then we see a multiplication of different measures. Indeed, maybe because the member states now also are feeling they have to implement something and that they're just going in different directions doing so. So that's, I think, the main challenge that we see right now.
Thanks, Francesca. We've got a number of questions coming in, very specific ones for Mr. Gray-Delou. I'm going to hold on those for just a second because they're very specific, and just keep it a little bit high level for a second. And just maybe just asking Mr. Gray Delu and Ms. Biraki, this complexity of, I guess, finding the right way forward, going after these Green Deal objectives, circular economy objectives, but also making it feasible for those who have to implement this to actually do this in a way that is semi-comfortable and predictable. It's not easy, right? And I think that, you have your 27 member states all juggling to do that. You have your different industries with their own, different challenges that they'll find. But just, generally, how you must get these questions a lot, right? This is really hard, they say, industry, and they're probably right. But then you probably also want to say, well, we're doing X to make sure that that works better. Obviously, you have a big opportunity with the packaging and packaging waste directive, but just, I guess, general question to you both, and if I may start with Mr. Gredelou, how exactly do you manage the complexity of all of this transposition and all of the details of something like this? It's actually really curious to hear what you have to say. Go ahead. Not that you have to have all the answers, but let's see what you have to say.
Okay, thank you. Well, it depends on what exactly. This enforcement of EU legislation is a big topic, and it depends on how your acquis, the body of legislation is composed of what. If it's more directives or regulations, it's very different approaches, and then also if it's internal market or some other legislation. So in DG Environment, for example, we have a lot of directives, and we have a system of dealing with that. So we first check the transposition. So we launch, there's a system, we work together with the Secretariat General to check which member states have transposed exactly on the date which is set in the directive and have adopted and notified their transposition measures. And if they have not, we launch infringements, and that's automatic. Immediately after a month later, they get an infringement. And these infringements go very quickly. So these are legal procedures, and they can end up, member state can end up at the Court of Justice, and the fines can be imposed on it very quickly. The only constraints in this, let's say, rapidity of our action is that we also have to analyze whether the non-transposition is actually the non-transposition or the substance-related issue. And we also usually act in batches. So we don't go just against, Austria and against Bulgaria, but we put several countries together. So once we have achieved the transposition, either on time or with some delays through infringements, then we check the substance of the transposition. And for that, we have also external studies for that, but we also do our in-house checking, and then we launch infringements for that as well. So this is the legal process with directives. And of course, we have also bad application cases when we receive complaints, or when we check on our own whether member states comply with the reporting requirements or targets or things like this. So these are the bad application. But then when it comes to internal market, we also have a preemptive tools, which is this 3 notification procedure. So that's entirely managed by DG Grow, but they consult the services which are connected. So if it's packaging, they consult us on the substance. And here we have, again, a number of possibilities. And what is really important, why I said preemptive, is that member states need to notify this legislation before they adopt it. So when, and it's a very wide interpretation of what actually technical regulations and these other measures that need to be notified actually are. So it's very broad. And in case member states don't notify, there is a Court of Justice case law which says that such legislation then cannot be applied against the subjects. So if a member state adopts some legislation which has not been notified and it's a technical regulation, then at the court they will not be able to impose such a legislation on its subjects. So that's already something. But of course we also constantly interact with the member states, remind them of their obligations and so on. And through this procedure, the 3 notification procedure, the Commission can interfere and ensure that there is the legislation in the member states actually, which could pose an internal market barrier, is not adopted in the first place. And just for information, last year, in 2020, we have received almost 900 notifications on DG Grow, and we issued 134 comments and more than 40 detailed opinions. Detailed opinions meaning that in this case, when we issue a detailed opinion, a country cannot adopt the legislation without consulting with the Commission on the final text.
Thanks very much for that. That's actually a fascinating, very concise 101 of how this works. I'm sure many people joining us today know the ins and outs of that, but for those who didn't know exactly how that gets done, it's actually really cool. Ms. Spiraki, just wondering, you're representing a member state, right? So you're on the other side of the coin a bit. Obviously, there are difficulties in transposing. There are local things happening. That being as it may, how can we make sure that we actually act as one union, that we break down these barriers, and how can we make sure that this all doesn't impede the green transition that we're all after? Obviously, you have very clear the pillars that you laid out. You seem to know exactly what needs to be done: setting standards, getting it done, making sure that packaging waste becomes a viable industry, right? All these things. So if you had to give us just, a few extra pointers on how we can make sure that we get everyone marching in the same line in the EU, what would you say?
Well, let me speak frankly and saying that, of course, I am cooperating very, very strongly with the Commission, but my heart is closely to the entrepreneurs, to the SMEs. And in this regard, I think that I can endorse Francesca's point. Allow me the first name basis, because it is important to understand that the SMEs and the industry as a whole needs a level playing field, needs also a stable and predictable investment environment. And in this regard, we are obliged to provide this in terms of legislation. So the first term we need to fulfill, to address, is better preparation in order to implement the legislation, the EU legislation, when it comes to a directive or when it comes to a regulation. And we have a lot of examples of lack of preparation in this field. And I fully endorse Francesca's point that there was a lack of preparation when it comes to the implementation of single-use plastic directive. Because the directive and the implementation of the directive was in advance of the guidelines that they followed. So there was a lot of questions coming from the member states and from my own member states, from my home country, Greece, asking how shall we implement this kind of legislation? This is the one point. The second point is that we have to have further engagement of the stakeholders. And when I'm focusing on it, because it's not only the representatives here in Brussels, it is also the SMEs, it is the small and medium enterprises in the member states, it is the family business, but we have to get engaged. And it is important to understand that they are facing a lot of barriers. And the case for us is how can we proceed with a single market? And by saying this, I would like to say that we face a new opportunity, which is the review of the packaging and the packaging waste directive, which is an opportunity to make some significant step forward in order to provide sustainable future for the products and for the consumers. And by saying this, I fully support an EU label for labeling packaging, because it is important to have a coordinated system, a streamlined system, in order to give the opportunities to consumer to understand how is it working. And it is one of the main issues that I would like to focus. And of course, the second one is to set the standards when it comes to biodegradability. We need to have alternatives when it comes to plastics. And biodegradables and compostable plastics are the alternatives. But we need to have clear alternatives with standards that they are implemented in the single market as a whole. And in this regard, I fully insist on setting standards in biodegradability and compostability before we start working on the revise of the packaging and packaging waste directive.
Thanks very much for that. Jerome, I want to just pick up on some of the earlier remarks that Ms. Spiraki had just made. Predictability, clarity, the fact that SMEs are a core part of any supply chain, whether it's packaging, whether it's sporting goods. All of these things must ring true to you a bit. I think you probably represent an industry that also wants just predictable. They want to know what's what they need to do in member state A, member state B. They just want clarity and predictability. Are there other things, that we can do with this single market as we bring it together for goods? As we look at the various legislation on the table, how can we make this all flow a bit more seamlessly, closer to the ideal of the single market project we set out to do?
Yeah, thank you for the interesting question. And I would also like to underline that many things that have been said, I agree with. From MEP Spiraki to what Francesca has mentioned, and also our colleague from the European Commission. I would say, just to summarize a little bit the situation we're in right now when it comes to the single market, which is, of course, initially the basis of the economic growth of the EU, is that the single market needs to be completed. And now with sustainability, digital transformation, all of this, we need to add certain things to make it complete. And for the time being, what is happening, what we see with member states is, I could summarize it with the sentence, hell is paved with good intentions. Basically, member states are scrambling. They have, protests, everything. So they need to address many things politically, and they need to transpose many initiatives that are happening at EU level into member states' regulations. And of course, they want to do well. There are environmental objectives, climate goals that everybody wants to achieve, the industry as well. But we are dealing with all of this also at EU level. I mean, for our sector, for example, we are involved in the EU textile strategy discussion, which is our version of the plastic strategy, basically. And we're also trying to make sure that this works well. We're involved in the sustainable product policy initiative, the extended producer responsibility guidelines, the substantiating green claims, the separate collection of textiles. I mean, there are so many things being dealt with or being developed for the time being at EU level that for us, it's very detrimental that member states start already doing things on their own unilaterally. And, to give you a couple of examples of trade barriers that we are faced with for the time being. And the first one is, national mandatory on product or on packaging labeling initiatives with sorting instructions and labels and logos that are popping up. I'm happy to hear about the TRIS notification system that on paper looks really good, and I think ourselves have been commenting on at least 10 TRIS notifications recently. We also, however, see that some member states are not even notifying at all. And, for our sectors, we are faced, let's just to mention, in France or in Italy, with initiatives that will be implemented in theory as of the 1st of January 2022. And our members will have to wonder whether they will have to comply with something that is still being discussed at TRIS notification levels. And we're talking here about on product labeling that will have unforeseen consequences, such as, for example, becoming a barrier for goods that are unsold. You cannot transfer them to another market. Then you have to change the label, or you have to change the packaging, or you have to create entire new labels. And then you will use ink, waste, water, energy, all of these scarce resources that we're all trying to save and that the Circular Economy Action Plan is trying to save. And in the end, we will spend and waste these resources more, although initially the goal of these initiatives, national initiatives, was to actually reduce these things. But, so this is why we are really pushing for harmonization, level playing field, and discussions at EU level, and after that, transposition into EU member states.
Thanks, Jerome. We've got a number of questions from the audience now, very much on the topic of circularity, achieving the circular economy with a focus on packaging and what do we do about it, right? So I'm going to try to encapsulate a lot. I'll be honest, a lot of them are quite dense questions with a lot of experts on the line today. So welcome everybody. I'll try to make it as layperson friendly as possible. If you're looking at some specific examples of what to do, talking about reuse schemes, about recycling schemes, more and more member states are looking to, one specific question, deposit return schemes, right? Encouraging people to bring back or somehow, get the materials that they've used back into the circular mix. There's some concern that this could lead to a certain fragmentation if you let the member states do their own thing, right? So what is your view as a panel? And maybe we can start with you, Mr. Gray-Delou. How might we harmonize these deposit return schemes across member states so that we understand exactly how to achieve that, I guess, predictability when we actually put them into practice? I think you're still muted. There you go.
Yes. Thank you. So the question is whether the European Commission intends or not to harmonize the deposit and return systems. This question has been coming up a lot, and what we are doing currently is something broader. So we are looking at harmonizing, in fact, the entire field of separate waste collection. This will still take some time. We have started with the work. Some of the stakeholders, probably also those online today, are involved with that work as stakeholders. They're invited to various workshops. So, and in this context, we are looking also at the need. So first we need to assess whether there is a real need to harmonize the deposit and return systems. So far, I have not seen really any very concrete examples of how these very local deposit and return systems can harm the internal market. But this all is being assessed, and you can contribute in this context to the work of the Commission. And then, of course, in the end, if there is a concrete need established, then we can do that. It's something that will be done probably under the framework of the Waste Framework Directive revision, which will start in 2023. So the Packaging Waste Directive revision will not come up with harmonized deposit and return system yet. The possibility, if the work of our consultant, which in case is a body of the Commission Joint Research Center, the consultant who is working on the separate waste collection model. So if they conclude this work earlier than the negotiations on packaging will complete, then it's of course possible to include some provisions also in there, but the initial proposal will not contain that.
Okay. Any other thoughts from the panel about how that might work? Just if not a must, because there's plenty of other questions, but wanted to open the floor. Jérôme, go ahead.
Yes, I mean, for us, so harmonized return and deposit schemes, for us, what we see is that often it is included in national extended producer responsibility schemes, EPR schemes. For our sector, the only real existing one currently is France. Another one is being developed in Sweden. And unfortunately, we see that the scope and the objectives of these EPR schemes are very different from one country to another. I know that the EU is working on EPR guidelines for this as well, but we do feel that as much as possible, we need to work on harmonization for this. And this will then also be, include a separate collection of textile waste, footwear, and so on. And for us, this is really important so that we can really generate a scaled up market for secondary raw materials. And this brings us to a second aspect, and that is very much linked to the internal market, which is the end of waste criteria. And here we really need to harmonize and understand when does a product start to become waste and can be considered as end of waste, so that we can put it back into the system and that we can have an intra-EU circulation of these products so that we put them back into the manufacturing process, because otherwise we have barriers between municipalities, countries, regions, where these products or end of life products cannot circulate. So these would be our recommendations, really, to harmonize these two aspects, APR and end of waste criterion.
Thanks, Jérôme. Francesca?
Yes, thanks, Brett. If I can just add a little bit further on that point, I think the key word we heard now a few times is harmonization. And to the point Jérôme was just making about the EPR schemes, thankful to the last review, the Waste Framework Directive, where there has been an effort already to introduce general minimum requirements for all member states. to follow, and also make them compulsory, because that was not the case. So now there is an obligation for member states to make this scheme compulsory. So there's already been an improvement. We know that starting point, specifically when it comes to waste, is very different across the EU. We know member states start from a different level, and there are some that have a lot of catching up to do. And Maya mentioned the harmonization of separate waste collection, and again, an important effort, and we're totally supportive of that. But I think it's also time that we see more effort coming, and infrastructure is the other key word. I think Ms. Biraki mentioned that at the beginning. So harmonization and infrastructure. So that's where we still see that the competencies and responsibility are not so well defined. So roles and responsibility have to be well defined. Just give a basic example. Our industry, my members, are asked to change color of bottles, size of bottles, so they can actually be put back into return scheme and then recycled. And when I discuss with waste management operators or others, then I hear that, it's a little bit challenging to change in color of the beans to harmonize them across Europe. It's a very silly example, but I think, we're all asked to make an effort, and that also requires roles and responsibility needs to be clearly defined to understand who needs to make the effort to what extent. If you really want to scale up the circular economy, to the point that also Jerome made concern the availability of the resources and the end-of waste criteria. That's also key, ensuring that those waste streams can actually move without the administrative restrictions that we now face. And we're clearly not talking about shipping something from Sicily to Sweden. We're very realistic, and also we know that there are inefficiency with long shipment. But then we need a little bit more flexibility in terms of bordering countries, for example, and making sure the material reaches the facility where they are present, to make sure that this then comes back into the value chain. So I think the infrastructure element there is really another big elephant in the room, which is difficult to address, of course, because then competencies are a bit scattered. Ms.
Biraki, I think you're raising your hand.
If I may, I'm not the expert on how can we harmonize the EPR and the deposit return schemes, but I would like to say that it is important for every and each member state, according to the treaty, to create profitable business cases in terms of recyclability and in terms of collecting waste, separate collection of waste. So I think that one of the proposed solutions is how can we encourage member states to increase their performance in terms of EPR schemes and in terms of deposit return scheme, by using the available instruments, which could be a tax on purchasing certain products, or a subsidy on a separate collection of the same product after use stage. But we have to consider that it will be something that it will take place in the neighborhood, maybe in member states that they are in a neighborhood like the Eastern Europe. But it is not something that we can harmonize during the period until 2030. But it is also important to create a profitable business case until 2030 in order to address our targets when it comes to the circular economy action plan. In this regard, I think that by incentivizing industries, incentivizing the consumers, and at the same time implementing, putting taxes in some kind of activities that they are not facilitating the separation of waste, we can find a balance. It's not the perfect balance, but it is a good start in order to have finally enough quantity of textiles, enough quantity of plastics of PET, enough quantity of packaging plastics in order to facilitate the creation of profitable business cases.
Absolutely. I mean, very clear points that you've made throughout about the need for this to work from an economic point of view, to make sure that the small companies or even larger companies can make sure that we create a market for the waste that actually leads to the circularity that we all seek. So thanks for that point. There's one burning question that this audience has, which I'll try to phrase. So the Packaging and Packaging Waste Directive is just that, a directive. It's not currently, there's no R in there for regulation at the moment. And I think the panel can also see the questions I have, just directing you to question number 7. Since directives allow member states to go further than the EU text when transposing, or maybe even leave a little wiggle room to go not as far, or a little bit of a gray area, perhaps one might argue. Is there any any thought process, or is there any reason why you might consider putting part of the PPWD into a regulation in order to avoid any further disruptions to the single market? So are we going towards regulation for any part of the PPWD is the question. This has been directed to the Commission. So as many of the questions are, as you see, so maybe we could start with you again, Mr. Greidelou, and then would love to hear other thoughts about this topic from others.
Okay, so just to be very clear about this, the final decision of whether transforming a directive on packaging into a regulation has not yet been taken. We have started drafting the provisions. We see that many provisions can be drafted a bit, by tweaking them a little bit, they can become a regulation or a directive. So I don't think, honestly, that it's a big difference whether you have a regulation or a directive. You can have a very detailed regulation, which leaves very little margin of discretion to the member states in how they implement it. Or you have a very vague regulation and you will still have to have a lot of implementing acts and also leave still some things to be decided to the national authorities in some cases. So what is the clear advantage of the regulation is clearly that there is no implementation period, let's say, the transposition period. So the period where member states are transposing a certain body of legislation into their national legislation. And in a way, then you leave it also to the market surveillance authorities to make sure that everything is implemented and applied as in the regulation. So you don't have this system, which I explained before, of checking the communication, conformity, and all this. It requires more resources on the side of the Commission, the resources that we currently really don't have. So for me, there are still very many questions that need to be answered before the final decision is taken. And yeah, we have not taken the final decision yet. That's all.
Great, thanks for that. Couldn't be clearer on where things stand there. Wonder if there are thoughts from anyone else on the panel about, I know that you all don't decide what's a directive versus a regulation, but certainly you may have an opinion. I think Ms. Biraki does.
Yes,
Yeah.
I fully support the Commission's approach because, of course, we have the transition period when it comes to the member states in order to fully endorse the legislation coming from here in Brussels, but it is only 24 months. The question is the question of the implementation, and that's why I think that the engagement of the national, local, regional and municipality authorities is very important, also the engagement of the stakeholders. In this regard, I think that it's not the case for transforming the directive into a regulation. The question is how can we have a further implementation, good rates of implementation in order to finalize our goal and in order to have sufficient quantity in order to address our circular economy goals, which is very, very important. It's one of the most progressive legislations in the world in terms of circularity. So we have to follow the path and engaging people starting from the basis, having a bottom-up approach, as I have said at the beginning, and at the same time insisting and putting some kind of pressures to the member state when it comes to the way that they are using the allocated funds for investments on issues that are affecting circular economy.
Fantastic. Very clear there. Ms. Biraki, I just wanted to stay with you for just one extra moment, right? So I think if you representing the elected body among us, right? Speaking with the collective voice of EU citizens, what do you think that they would say to EU policymakers when it comes to the single market and the Green Deal objectives, right? So what is the number one message that you would like to bring to industry, to the Commission? What's the simple message? What do we need to do to get goods moving across borders in a circular, in a green way? In one really crisp sentence. I'm very curious what that is.
Investments in green energy, sustainable products, setting standards, and of course, simplification in order to have a great rates of implementation. This is the question that we have to tackle as soon as possible without losing any further time.
Again, couldn't be clearer at all. So thanks again for that. I think it's very clear what needs to be done here. We're looking at a single market that's coming together for goods, for services, for people, as it always has meant to be. We've got some clear opportunities ahead. We have the packaging and the packaging waste directive. Who knows? Maybe it might become a regulation. Anybody's guess. I'm not a betting man, so I wouldn't say. But I think what we're looking at, is a way to easily move things across borders in a way that is predictable for both SMEs, for big companies, and that we can actually act as the union that we aim to be. So thanks everyone for that. Francesca, I just wanted to pass it to you, maybe just to give us a few final remarks on your thoughts from what you heard today and what we need to do next.
Yes, thank you very much, Brett. And indeed, it's been really interesting and really want to thank all the fellow speakers on the panel, because I think the elements that have been shared really touch the heart of the issue. I think it also shows that, it is an issue that we need to talk about, and we need to find common solution together. At the level of all the institutions, but also, us as industry, and do our part. The one thing, perhaps, the catchphrase that I've taken and I heard a couple of times over the course of the discussion is that, we don't need 27 mini markets. And perhaps I would go as far as say we don't need 27 circular economy. We need a single circular economy. And I think the fact that we don't have that yet, and the single market is really the tool to reach that goal, shows the importance of further work that needs to be done to make sure that we create that environment. So again, it's not just a matter of making sure that companies can operate, continue to move goods because it's good for competitiveness. It's really essential if we are serious about delivering the green transition. So we need a functioning single market, and we need one single circular economy at the same time.
So hands up if you agree that we do not need 27 circular mini economies or 27 single markets. But we need, how many do we actually need? And just show me the number that you think we need. That's what I thought. That's a fun participatory exercise at the end of a webinar, right, Nat? So thanks again, everyone. So Maya de Grey-Delou from the Commission, Ms. Spiraki from the European Parliament, Jerome from the European Federation of the European Sporting Goods Industry, and Francesca from EUROPEN. It's been a great hour with you all. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of your questions, but really wanted to make sure that we could get to the crunchiest ones. Thanks for tuning in. Thanks to Dodds. And I'm sure we'll see you here again another time. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.